If I told you that one tree could hold a family's history, would you believe me? That a living, breathing oak could carry not just leaves, but generations of laughter, grief, and hope? Now imagine watching that symbol of everything you hold dear, your roots, your memories, vanish overnight without warning, while the person responsible smiled and called it progress. This isn't just a story about a tree. It's a story about betrayal, loss, and the kind of neighbor you pray you'll never meet. And it all began the day Karen moved in next door. The house at the end of Maple Drive wasn't just another weathered home shaded by towering trees. It was a living monument to my family, a story written in bricks, wood, and roots. My grandparents had built it from the ground up after the Second World War, pouring everything they had into a modest two-story home framed by a wide front lawn. It wasn't grand, but it was sacred. Birthdays, backyard weddings, whispered Christmas Eve secrets. The very walls hummed with memory. When I was a child, the house felt like a fairy tale castle. I would race down the long driveway, barefoot, feeling the warm gravel under my feet. I remember summers under the massive oak tree out front, its thick branches turning into pirate ships' castles or spaceships, depending on where my imagination took me. When my grandfather passed away, it was devastating. Still, my grandmother stayed another decade, tending to the house and the tree as if both were pieces of him she could still touch. When she passed too, 15 years ago, the house became mine, a bittersweet inheritance. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a promise. Protect the past so it could shelter the future. Right there, planted firmly in the center of the yard, stood the oak. Not just any tree, an 80-foot-tall guardian, older than even my grandparents' marriage. My grandfather had planted it with his own tiny hands when he was no older than 5. As it grew, it became a constant in our lives, its gnarled trunk like a storyteller weaving family legends. Every fall, it became a golden inferno, dropping cascades of leaves that we would rake into mountains and leap into with reckless glee. During storms, its branches swayed like a ship at sea, and during quiet spring mornings, robins and squirrels made their haven. More than its beauty, it was ours. The tree stood for resilience, for legacy, for the kind of rootedness most people spend a lifetime searching for. I'd even had the property surveyed years ago, just to be sure. The oak was fully on my land, its roots deep, its trunk well within my fence line. I couldn't have known then how important that proof would become. At first, Karen seemed harmless enough, just another new face moving into the cozy white house next door. It had been vacant for a few months after old Mrs. Darren had sold it and moved closer to her grandchildren. I missed Mrs. Darren already. She had been the kind of neighbor who lent you sugar with a smile and invited you to backyard barbecues. Karen arrived on a cloudy afternoon with a moving truck, a couple of squabbling kids, and a sour expression that seemed permanently stitched to her face. I baked a batch of pumpkin bread, a tradition in our neighborhood to welcome new folks, and walked it over warm towel over the loaf. When she opened the door, she looked at me like I had just handed her a dead fish. "Oh," she said, visibly unimpressed. "I thought you might like some fresh bread. Welcome to the neighborhood," I said with my best smile. She took the loaf without thanks and shut the door. The first warning sign wasn't a slam. It was a chill that radiated from her, a complete absence of warmth that made the air between us feel colder than the November wind. By the time the first leaf began to fall that autumn, Karen's complaints started raining down faster than the oak's golden showers. At first, it was casual grumbling at the mailbox. "Your tree is such a nuisance," she muttered, shaking leaves from her designer boots. Then it escalated, passive-aggressive notes on my door, angry muttering when we crossed paths. She even started scooping piles of leaves from her yard and dumping them onto mine, as if Mother Nature herself was my personal failing. I tried to laugh it off at first. After all, the oak had been there long before Karen, and likely would outlive her tantrums. The neighborhood kids loved playing in the crunchy piles. Even the squirrels seemed unbothered. But Karen wasn't a woman to be ignored. Every leaf that fluttered onto her manicured lawn was, to her, a declaration of war. Soon, she wasn't just upset about the mess. She began ranting that the tree blocked her sunlight, ruined her curb appeal, and made her property value plummet. No amount of kind words, gentle explanations, or baked goods could temper her growing fury. In an effort to cool the growing animosity, I reached out again. During Thanksgiving, I baked her a tray of pecan squares, a family recipe, and left them at her door with a handwritten note inviting her and her kids to our annual holiday tree lighting. I even suggested she and her children join us for yoga at the community center or crafting days at the library, thinking maybe she just felt isolated. Maybe, just maybe, the real issue wasn't the tree at all. Maybe she needed to feel welcome. But Karen didn't take the bait. She responded to my invitations with curt rejections. I don't have time for silly hobbies. I'm a single mother. Some of us have real responsibilities. The final nail in the coffin was a comment she made one freezing morning in December, as we both collected our mail. You just don't want to talk about the real problem. That tree ruins everything, and you're selfish for keeping it. I stood there, mouth open, snowflakes melting on my jacket, realizing that no amount of goodwill could save the situation. Karen didn't want to be a part of the community. She wanted to tear down everything that didn't fit into her narrow idea of perfect. And my grandfather's oak, the beating heart of my home, was her #1 target. Some wars don't start with armies. They start with whispered threats and unspoken resentment, the kind you can feel crawling up your spine before a single shot is fired. By the time I realized how far Karen was willing to go to destroy what I loved most, it was too late. This wasn't just neighborly tension anymore. This was a full-scale siege, and my family's history was caught in the crossfire. The first official shot fired came wrapped in a smug smile and a flimsy business card. It was a crisp Saturday morning in early March when Karen marched up my front steps and rang the bell. I opened the door, wiping soil from my hands. I've been transplanting spring flowers under the shade of the oak. She thrust a card at me, the words Timber Solutions printed in bold, aggressive font. You need to cut that tree down, she said. No greeting. No small talk. I already told you, Karen. It's not happening. She crossed her arms, her nails tapping against her designer jacket. It infringes on my property. I have rights, you know. I stared at her, stunned. It doesn't. I had a survey done 2 years ago. That tree and every one of its roots is on my land. Karen smiled tightly, as if she'd been expecting that answer. Well, it blocks sunlight to my children's bedrooms. It's an environmental hazard. Environmental hazard? I almost laughed, but I caught the dangerous glint in her eye. Karen wasn't making conversation anymore. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something much worse. The following week, a letter appeared in my mailbox. Not a friendly handwritten note, but a stern warning from a local mediation lawyer. Karen had filed an official complaint, demanding an urgent resolution to the encroachment caused by my tree. Attached were grainy photos of her house, bathed in shadows, as if darkness itself was proof of my guilt. I immediately called my own lawyer, digging out the property survey like a soldier loading ammunition. The records were clear. The tree sat 5 full feet away from the boundary line, well within my rights. Still, Karen wasn't backing down. She hired her own surveyor, a cheap, questionable operation, and suddenly new pink flags started appearing suspiciously close to the oak's roots. It was a blatant lie. Neighbors started noticing the tension, too. Whispers began to ripple through the community. Some people siding with me, others nervously keeping their heads down, not wanting to get caught between warring neighbors. What they didn't know was that Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was building a narrative, one that cast herself as the innocent victim, and me as the cruel, selfish villain. One afternoon, Karen caught me in the driveway. She was flanked by her 2 children, who she clutched like shields. "Don't you care about children?" she snapped before I could even greet her. "Of course I do," I said carefully. "Then why wouldn't you cut down that death trap?" Her voice had a shrill edge that made my skin crawl. The boys stared at me with wide, confused eyes, clearly coached but unsure why they were supposed to hate the nice neighbor who baked cookies at Christmas. "I'm sorry, Karen, but that tree isn't dangerous. It's healthy, it's strong, and it means more to me than you can imagine." Karen's face hardened into stone. "So that's it? You're just going to wait until it falls on someone? You're just going to sit back while it ruins my family's life?" I didn't answer. There was no point. She didn't want conversation. She wanted submission. And the worst part was, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen was just getting started. The days grew longer. Spring blossomed in bright greens and yellows across the neighborhood. But the air between our two houses stayed frozen, brittle with tension. Karen stopped speaking altogether. No more snide comments at the mailbox, no passive-aggressive glares across the fence. Instead, she moved into silent warfare, blowing leaves from her yard into mine with a leaf blower every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, filing petty HOA complaints about yard debris, i.e., a few scattered leaves that landed naturally, hosting loud playdates where kids accidentally trampled my flower beds, calling the city to inspect my property for code violations. Each small act chipped away at the peace I'd worked so hard to protect. Each attack was invisible enough to seem petty, but relentless enough to erode the ground beneath me. It wasn't about the tree anymore. It was about control, about forcing me to bow to her will. And the more I resisted, the more obsessed she became. When my cousin announced she was having a destination wedding in the Dominican Republic, I hesitated. A week away, leaving my house and the tree vulnerable? But my family insisted. You need a break. My mother said over the phone, you're allowed to live your life too. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking things. After all, what could Karen really do in a week? Sure, she was vindictive, but she wouldn't do anything illegal, right? I arranged for my neighbor across the street, Mrs. Patel, to keep an eye on the house. I double-locked every door. I even installed a Ring camera facing the front yard, just for peace of mind. When I boarded the plane, I felt a pang of unease but pushed it down. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to relax, to laugh with cousins under a blazing sun, dance barefoot in the sand, and toast to new beginnings. But lurking underneath it all was a storm I couldn't see, a storm that would rip away more than just my trust. When I landed back home, suntanned and smiling, I had no idea the horror waiting for me just down Maple Drive. Some moments punch the breath right out of you. 1 minute you're smiling, expecting home to wrap you in warmth. The next, you're staring into a hollow grave where your family's legacy used to stand. I thought I'd faced storms before, but nothing could prepare me for the devastation that Karen left behind, or for the battle that was about to begin. When the taxi turned onto Maple Drive, the first thing I noticed was the way the streetlights gleamed too brightly across my lawn. It was disorienting, like staring at a familiar face that had lost its eyes. As we rolled closer, realization crashed into me like a freight train. The oak tree was gone. Not broken, not storm damaged. Gone. No stump, no branches, no shredded remains scattered across the yard. Only a brutal emptiness where a towering life had once stood. I stumbled out of the car, luggage forgotten, the front porch light buzzing weakly overhead. My hands shook as I touched the cold, bare earth. It felt wrong, like touching a wound that would never heal. This wasn't nature. This wasn't decay. This was violence. And then I saw it. The faint tracks in the soil, deep ruts where heavy machinery had crushed my flower beds, leaving scars across the yard like claw marks. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Who could have done this? Why hadn't anyone called me? And worst of all, was it Karen? The second shock hit, just as the first was sinking in. Caution tape flapped in the wind around Karen's house. Yellow plastic cordoned off the property like a crime scene. The roof on the right side had caved inward. The rafters twisted like broken bones under moonlight. Tarps sagged over the damage. Too little, too late. It wasn't just a minor accident. Her home was mangled, battered as if the universe itself had dropped a hammer straight through it. A neighbor, Mr. Jenkins from 3 houses down, walked past with his dog, his face tight with unease. Terrible thing, he muttered. I wanted to ask more. I burned to know the whole story. But the look he gave me warned me off. Fear, guilt. Something had everyone on Maple Drive locking their lips tight. And somehow I knew without a doubt. Karen's wrecked roof, my missing tree, they were not unrelated. Later that night, I sat alone in my dark living room, 1,000 questions spinning in my head. Why hadn't anyone warned me? Where was Mrs. Patel, who promised to keep an eye on the house? Where were the neighbors who usually couldn't wait to gossip about a stray cat crossing the street? The silence was deafening. I checked my phone again, flipping through texts, emails, voicemails. Nothing. No alerts. No emergency calls. It was as if the world had conspired to keep me in the dark, letting Karen execute whatever twisted plan she had without resistance. The longer I sat there, the angrier I became, because this wasn't just about property damage. This was about betrayal, and I knew that no one, no neighbor, no Karen, no stranger, was going to explain it to me. If I wanted answers, I would have to rip them from the ground myself. Finding Karen wasn't hard. Word around town traveled fast, even if it traveled quietly. A few discreet inquiries revealed she and her kids were staying in a shelter 2 towns over, displaced after the accident. I didn't wait a day. I drove straight there the next morning, the sky gray and heavy above me, like it too was holding its breath. The shelter was a modest brick building tucked behind a strip mall, its windows fogged by the cold. I asked at the front desk and, after some polite persistence, found her sitting at a metal picnic table across the street, her kids playing nearby on cracked asphalt. Karen spotted me immediately, her mouth pressed into a thin, bitter line. Good. Let her be uncomfortable. I approached slowly, my hands clenched at my sides. We need to talk, I said. She nodded once, curtly. Not here. Walk. We crossed to a ragged patch of park, the ground frozen and barren. I stopped under a stunted tree, a far cry from the mighty oak that had once graced my front lawn, and faced her fully. Now, I said, my voice steady. Tell me what happened. Karen folded her arms tightly across her chest, shifting from foot to foot. For a moment, she said nothing, just scowling at the horizon. Finally, she hissed, "Your damn tree wrecked my house." I laughed, short and sharp. No, Karen, trees don't just fall over for no reason, especially not healthy oaks. So what really happened? She snapped her head toward me, eyes blazing. I had it cut down, she spat. It was a menace. It had to go. My vision tunneled. You had it cut down without my permission? It was infringing on my rights, she shouted. You wouldn't listen. You were selfish. You didn't care about what it was doing to my family. And you thought trespassing, vandalism, and theft were the solution? I said, my voice rising. Karen sneered. Call it whatever you want. That tree was a threat, and you knew it. If you had been reasonable, none of this would have happened. And the roof? I pressed. Karen's face twisted. The idiot tree guy. He screwed up, cut it wrong. The tree fell the wrong way. It crushed the roof. Nearly killed us. So this wasn't nature, I said softly. This was you. Your greed. Your impatience. Your stupidity. Karen shook her head violently. But the damage was done. The truth lay bare between us, ugly and irreversible. I should sue you, she muttered. I laughed again, hollow and cold. Go ahead, Karen. But after what you did, it won't be me losing in court. Some battles end with apologies. Others end with scars. But when you're facing someone who twists the truth like a weapon, who would rather burn everything down than admit they're wrong, there's no simple ending. There's only survival. Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was rewriting the story, painting herself the hero and me the villain, one cruel lie at a time. The first sign that Karen wasn't going to accept responsibility came the very next day. She called me, brazenly, from the shelter's common line, and before I could even say hello, she was shouting into the receiver. You sabotaged me, she shrieked. You set me up. You wanted the tree to fall on my house, didn't you? The words hit me like ice water. Not only was she refusing to acknowledge her crime, she was inventing new ones, spinning a fantasy where she was a helpless victim and I was some calculating villain. You're out of your mind, I said, forcing my voice to stay low and even. You hired an unlicensed hack to trespass on my land and butcher a healthy tree. The consequences are yours, Karen. She didn't listen. She raved, tears or rage, maybe both, choking her voice. I'm going to the police. I'm going to the media. Everyone will know what you did. I hung up because there's no reasoning with someone who's already decided that the truth is an inconvenience. And I realized with a sick twist in my gut, Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos. First came the police. Two polite but visibly exhausted officers knocked on my door asking for my side of the story. I explained everything. The tree was entirely on my property. I had never given permission for it to be cut down. I had been out of the country at the time of the incident. I had a property survey, dated photos, and neighbors willing to testify. The officers nodded, clearly unsurprised. Apparently, Karen had called multiple times, each complaint more unhinged than the last. Next came the insurance investigations. Karen had filed a claim for massive damages, but the adjusters uncovered the real story quickly. She had hired an uncertified, uninsured tree removal guy. The so-called professional hadn't even filed the proper permits. His equipment was outdated, his technique reckless. The fall of the tree wasn't an accident in nature. It was human negligence. Because of this, her insurance was voided. No payout, no repairs, no sympathy. Karen had gambled, and she lost everything. But it wasn't just Karen who suffered. Walking across my lawn felt like walking through a war zone. Where once there had been lush grass, soft underfoot, now there were deep gouges where heavy machinery had torn through. My flower beds, my grandmother's heirloom roses, the lilies we planted as children, were churned into muddy pulp. Even the stone walkway my grandfather had laid, one square at a time, was cracked and ruined by careless equipment. I stood there for hours one evening, surveying the destruction. It wasn't just a tree that had been taken from me. It was decades of care, of tradition, of living memory, and it had been ripped away, not by disaster, not by time, but by a neighbor's selfishness. Karen had hurt herself, but she had also hurt me, and she wasn't going to walk away from it without consequences. Karen's problem snowballed fast after the insurance report came back. First, the agency formally denied her claim, citing gross negligence for hiring an unlicensed contractor. Then, because she had lied about the circumstances initially, they threatened to drop her coverage entirely. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. Karen's house, battered, broken, open to the winter air, sat dark and empty most days. The few times I spotted her returning to gather belongings, she wore sunglasses, her head bowed low. Pity tried to creep in, but I shoved it down. She hadn't just hurt herself. She had attacked my home, my family's legacy, without regret, without even basic respect. She had built her future on lies, and now it was crumbling under her own feet. Just when I thought the madness might end, the registered letter arrived. A heavy envelope with bold, unforgiving legal print. Inside, a formal notice that Karen was suing me for $85,000. The audacity stole my breath. In her lawsuit, she claimed that my negligence, my refusal to cut down the dangerous tree, had directly caused her home's destruction. She painted herself as a martyr who had taken action to protect the community and demanded full compensation. Reading through her claims felt like slipping into an alternate reality, one where facts were optional and delusion ruled. But one thing was clear as glass. Karen wasn't just trying to save herself. She was trying to ruin me, too. And I made a vow right then and there. She might have cut down my tree, but she wasn't going to uproot me, not without a fight. Sometimes the ones who tear you down don't realize they've also handed you the weapon to fight back. Karen thought cutting down my tree would crush me. She thought her lies would bury me. But she made one fatal mistake. She underestimated how far I would go to defend what mattered most. And now it was my turn. The moment I finished reading Karen's lawsuit, I knew there was no room left for second chances, no hope for understanding. I wasn't just dealing with a bad neighbor anymore. I was facing someone who would burn the truth to the ground and dance in the ashes. I sat at my kitchen table under the dim light, the notice spread out in front of me, and felt a rare, icy calm settle over me. I wasn't going to pay her a single cent, not because I couldn't. Although $85,000 was more than I had access to without selling the house, but because I wasn't guilty. Karen had made her choices. Now it was time for her to deal with the consequences. But I couldn't just be reactive anymore. It was time to go on offense. With Claire's guidance, we filed a counter lawsuit against Karen, not just in response to her ridiculous $85,000 claim, but as a fully armed assault, trespassing, property destruction, theft of natural resources, emotional distress, loss of historical property value. Our lawsuit wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a sledgehammer. Claire had even gathered statements from other neighbors, including Mrs. Patel, who finally admitted she'd seen unfamiliar work trucks in my house during my vacation, but had been too intimidated to intervene. Even Mr. Jenkins provided a quiet, nervous affidavit. Piece by piece, we built a mountain of evidence. Karen had no permit, no permission, no legitimate contractor. All she had was her ego and a rapidly collapsing defense. The court date was set, and as we prepared, Claire told me, "Make no mistake. We're not just going to win, we're going to make an example." The first hearing was held in the local courthouse, a simple brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and brewing coffee. Karen showed up wearing an ill-fitting suit, her face pinched and pale. She didn't look like the fiery avenger from the shelter anymore. She looked exactly like what she was, a desperate woman who had overplayed her hand. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, listened carefully to opening statements. Karen's lawyer, a cheap journalist she clearly hired in a panic, argued that the tree posed an immediate danger and that Karen had exercised her civic duty by removing it. Claire stood when it was our turn, her voice clear and confident. She presented the survey. She presented the arborist report. She presented affidavits from neighbors. She even showed before and after photos of the tree, from lush and living to brutally erased. And then she said the words that set the tone for the entire trial. "Your Honor, the defendant's actions were not the result of a desperate attempt to preserve safety. They were the product of entitlement, trespass, and criminal negligence." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sweat beading along her forehead. The battle had begun, and I could feel it already. The tide was turning in my favor. The next morning, I called a name given me by a friend in the city, an attorney who specialized in property disputes and tree law. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and within the first 5 minutes of our meeting, I knew she was exactly what I needed. Claire was sharp, direct, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting property rights. I laid out everything: the history of the tree, the sentimental and historical value, the clear property line survey, Karen's trespass and unauthorized destruction. Claire nodded, her pen flying across her yellow legal pad. "Good news," she said finally, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "You have a strong case. Very strong. Karen's lawsuit is flimsy at best. And better yet, we're not just going to defend you, we're going to counterattack." A small ember of hope flickered to life in my chest. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about justice. For my family, for my home, and for everything Karen had tried to steal from me. Claire arranged for an independent arborist to visit my property, a seasoned expert named Mr. Saunders, who had worked in conservation for over 30 years. He examined the shallow gouges in the soil, the damaged flower beds, and the small, brutal stump that remained like a tombstone in the earth. When he finished, he delivered his report with the grim gravity of a funeral director. The tree was likely between 80 and 90 years old, perfectly healthy, zero signs of rot or instability. He paused, shaking his head. A tree of that size and age, in good health? Market value: between $37,500 and $75,000, depending on species and local significance. And that's not including replacement costs or sentimental value. The number stunned me. Of course, no amount of money could bring the oak back, could stitch my memories back into the landscape, but knowing its tangible worth gave me new fire. Karen hadn't just committed vandalism. She had committed grand theft. And now we could prove it. They say the truth always wins. But no one ever talks about the battle it takes to get there. The sleepless nights, the moments when doubt creeps in like a thief. Karen thought she could rewrite reality. She thought money, lies, and stubbornness could destroy the legacy that Tree stood for. She was wrong. And the moment the judge spoke the final verdict, the weight of generations lifted off my shoulders and landed squarely on hers. The courtroom was dead silent as the judge shuffled the papers in front of him, Every second dragged like a lifetime. Karen's lawyer shifted nervously. Karen herself sat rigid, her knuckles white around the edge of the table. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice firm and final. Ms. Karen's case against Mr./Ms. Opie is hereby dismissed with prejudice. The words seemed to explode through the courtroom. Karen blinked rapidly, as if she couldn't process what she just heard. I sat very still, heart hammering but face calm. The judge wasn't finished. He turned to address the counterclaim, my lawsuit against Karen, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just dismissing her lies. He was about to hold her accountable. The judge's ruling was even more powerful than we had dared to hope. He awarded me $75,000 for the destruction of the oak tree, the maximum valuation confirmed by the arborist report. He added another $5,000 for legal fees, recognizing Karen's bad faith behavior throughout the ordeal. And, unexpectedly, he also awarded damages for emotional distress, citing the deep personal significance of the tree and the deliberate nature of Karen's actions. The final figure? $80,000. Claire smiled at me, a quiet, victorious smile that felt like sunlight after months of storm clouds. Karen, on the other hand, looked like a woman unraveling in slow motion. Her mouth opened, maybe protest, maybe to plead, but the judge had already moved on to the next case. Her moment was over, and mine had just begun. Within 6 months, Karen's house went up for sale. The listing stayed online for weeks, the bright photos unable to hide the darkness that lingered behind its walls. Eventually, it sold. To a young couple, newlyweds excited to build their first home. When they moved in, I brought over a basket of fresh bread and honey, just as my grandparents had done for every new neighbor. The wife hugged me at the door. The husband promised to join the next community barbecue. There were smiles, laughter, the easy hopefulness of new beginnings. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the golden sunset spill across the yard, I realized something profound. The roots my grandfather planted weren't just in the earth. They were in me. And no act of destruction, no selfish neighbor, no petty war could ever tear them out. Not really. Not ever. It didn't take long for the consequences to crush Karen. Unable to pay the judgment out of pocket, she was forced to take out a second mortgage on her already damaged home, a home that still bore the wounds of her own arrogance. Neighbors whispered about it over fences and at backyard barbecues. Some pitied her. Most didn't, because by now the truth had spread. Everyone knew what had really happened. The trespass, the sabotage, the lawsuit, the loss. Karen became a ghost in the neighborhood. No more loud complaints. No more entitled demands. Just a shadow slipping in and out of her broken house, burdened by a debt she had earned with her own hands. With the settlement money, I didn't just repair the damage. I rebuilt. I hired the best landscapers in town to restore the soil, mend the flower beds, and repave the stone path my grandfather once laid by hand. I even installed a wrought iron bench facing the spot where the oak once stood, engraved with a single line, "Roots run deeper than hate." But the crown jewel was the new trees. 3 young oaks, strong, healthy saplings chosen for their resilience and beauty, planted side by side where the original had once reigned. I knew it would take decades for them to reach the size and majesty of my grandfather's tree. But that wasn't the point. The point was growth, healing, hope. And every time I watered them, every time I watched their leaves shiver in the breeze, I felt the pulse of something stronger than anger or grief. Legacy, family, home.